Religious education. Sorry for the delay. We're having some technical issues. My name is Michael Haldis. This is coming to you through the Orthodox Christian Network and the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland, on a very rainy, kind of low-key, low-energy day. So hopefully we'll have a good dialogue. It's more upbeat. So it's been a while since we were live. I think it was April 2nd. Of course, we had Holy Week and Pascha. And then because our church is St. George, April 23rd, St. George's Day, we had the bishop here, one of the bishops. So we didn't have class that day. So now we're going to resume today, next week, and then we'll conclude near the end of May. So we had started last time talking about essentially our identity in Christ and all of the obstacles that lead to that. And we didn't get too far in the discussion in terms of the plan material, but we had a very good discussion. So I'm going to kind of pick up where we left off, and I want this to be interactive. So I'm going to start with a quote and then get everybody's reaction to it online or in the room. This is for Father Stephen Freeman, who I quote quite a bit. And I probably should explain that. Long ago, when I kind of began this journey in earnest in Orthodoxy, I had a certain orientation to things. I wrote a book called Sacramental Living, and Truly He is Risen. Somebody just joined. And so I was very much into understanding the sacramental nature of reality. And so my process was I kind of got things out of my head. I wrote them down. But before I shared it in anything like that, of course, I went back and started looking to make sure, because, one of the things that we all have to be careful of, any of us, is that if we're going to do any teaching or writing, that we want to be in keeping with the church, the Holy Fathers, the Holy Tradition. And in these days of self-publishing and all that stuff, it's very easy to just go put yourself out there. But you always want to put yourself out through existing bodies because you want checks and balances. And then I came across Father Stephen Freeman's work, and I found that we think a lot alike, except I think he thinks better and smarter than I do. So I quote him quite a bit. And anyway, a little backdrop in case you wonder why I bring him up. But here's a quote that he has that I want to start off with. He says, "Much of what we think is our identity will shift and change somewhat in various settings, are the constructs we have managed to assemble over time, while our true self remains hidden." So as I take a bite of this cookie, think about that for a minute and see if you agree or disagree, and if so, why?
Say it one more time.
Yeah, repeat again.
Now as I'm chewing.
Yeah.
Okay. Much of what we think is our identity. Good morning, Andrew. Much of what we think is our identity, then he says parenthetically, which will shift and change somewhat in various settings, are the constructs we have managed to assemble over time, while our true self remains hidden. So my question to you is, do you agree or disagree? And if so, why? And as always, this isn't like a right or wrong thing. This is just a provocative question to get us dialoguing about what it means. Louise, by the way, says, can I recommend Mystery of Faith by Metropolitan Hilarion? I can bring it up, Louise. I haven't read it yet, so I can't recommend it in good conscience. But if you've read it and think it's good, I'm certainly happy to say that on the air, which I just did. Okay. So you think our identities are more of a construct over time, like more of almost an external construct, while our self remains hidden to ourselves and other people? That's what he's essentially getting at. There's nodding of heads in the room.
Absolutely.
So that's yes. So
just by the way, Michael, I'm looking at that book of Plato, and I'm thinking of, the idea of, the forms and the shadow and stuff like that. He sounds like he's going in that direction.
A little bit. Oh, speaking of Plato and speaking of Greeks, did you guys catch the humor in today's epistle? Acts 6, 1-7, when the Hellenists complained that the Hellenists were Greek. I'm digressing for a moment. Hellenists were Jews, but they were Greek-speaking Jews, more oriented to Greek culture. And they were complaining that they weren't getting as much of the distribution of goods as other people. And then the apostles said, okay, fine. And then let's choose seven people. We'll make deacons to do that. So all the names they chose were Greek names, which implies you complained about it, you fix it.
Yeah.
Little is changed in human nature, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I
That's
digress.
a good point.
Yeah, I thought it was funny. You made me think. I mean, you brought up Greeks and Plato. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm going down that road. Maybe, but there's a scripture, 1 Corinthians 13:12. It comes at the end of Paul's love treatise, if you will. Remember, love is patient, love is kind. And he says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known." So he's talking about that intimacy with God, like, face to face. Moses spoke to God face to face as a friend in the Old Testament. Of to know and be known. You've heard that expression before, where you gaze into the face of God and you're known and you know Him. So he's talking about that depth. So, don't you think we all kind of want that? Isn't that our deepest desire, to be known and to know? Yes, no. That's why we enter into friendships and marriage and all these relational things. So, but the question, I guess, is that really true? Do we really want to be known with all that it entails? Or is it the constructs of our identity that we want some things to be known?
You're picking and choosing.
I know, I'm getting there.
You're
And I tell you, this is going to be a tough one today.
Picking and choosing.
Yeah. Like for instance, maybe if you guys really knew me, you wouldn't want me to be teaching anything or facilitating anything, right?
I got past that bird.
Yeah, thank you for that grace. But seriously, we all have warts, right? We all have resumes that are not so good versus the good, and we don't want people to know these things.
Well, what is it like, that awesome judgment seat of God? I mean, that's when you're going to be known and you're going to be,
Yeah, we talked about that in here a couple of weeks ago. Did a podcast. We use language like the awesome, the dread, the fearful. We interchange those words because the Greek isn't easily translated, and I guess it depends. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. But let's stick on this for a minute. So, what do you think about identities? What do you think about yourselves? Do we feel like we know ourselves even? Do we know other people? Are we in identity crisis personally? Are we in identity crisis as a nation? I don't know. Getting deep on a rainy Sunday morning.
We definitely wear masks. Many of us. Most of us.
So
I think we have
wear mask.
wear masks.
That comes from the Greek word for mask. It's hypocrite, right?
Yeah.
So online, Luis says, I don't think that's the case. We may come across the secret of other people, but we can never hide anything from our Lord. Absolutely. Oh, it's Father. Yeah, we can't hide anything from God, but we certainly try. I mean, this goes all the way back to the garden, right? Hiding. As a matter of fact, we could say that's where the identity crisis really began, if we believe we're in one. What do you think? Maybe I'm throwing too many questions out at once before we explore. But what do you think shame has to do with this? Remember, in the beginning of the year, this class year, we spent some time talking about shame, and I've brought it up quite a bit off and on. But what do you think the role of shame plays in our identities and knowing ourselves?
Well, shame helps us to self-reflect and look inside of ourselves and to figure it out. You don't have shame. It becomes really difficult. Then you're just out there,
Yep. Anybody else have any thoughts on shame?
Well, shame also lingers with you a lot of times. I mean, I remember that discussion, and a lot of us never can get past that fully.
I would say that most of us. I mean, I know there's things I'm aware of, but I don't know that I've gotten past them. That maybe being aware of them is better than not being aware, but it's still hard to get past, right? I mean,
shame also takes down the ego.
Yeah, because there's different types of shame.
Mm-hmm.
You guys remember? I know it's a long time ago, and I don't remember who was even here when we talked about this. But you remember the distinction we talked about between healthy shame versus toxic shame or unhealthy shame. Do you remember the distinction? Anybody care to articulate if they remember well? Or?
I wasn't here for that.
Okay,
Is
Andrew.
that the shame in the sense that the shame that allows you to grow as a
Mhm.
person is the healthy shame because you're bettering yourself? The shame that isn't is the one that you let destroy you.
Mhm.
And you don't grow by a learning experience, but you just let it break you down.
Yep.
To the point you can't move forward.
Right. Good. Well said. And it has to do with a lot has to do with boundaries. Right.
Well, shame is also a way that, society makes people do things that
Yes.
aren't in there by law, but, there's a moral component to it. And then I have a question for you. What
Sure.
about people that feel no shame?
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, you guys are hitting on exactly where I kind of
Yeah.
think we need to talk about. So the shame you articulated, Andrea, is a healthy shame. It's one that knows boundaries. Because think about in the Garden of Eden, how what God did. He created. So first of all, everything was done through love, right? And he created us for communion with him. And because of freedom, there was naturally a boundary not to be crossed because they had freedom, and it was freedom to grow in further communion with him with the intent of the tree of life. But the tree of knowledge of good and evil expressed our ability to be free to make choices. And of course, what did Adam and Eve do? They exercised their freedom. So they exceeded the boundary. So to your point, what are some of the messages we get in our culture today? Sky's the limit. No constraints.
Me.
Yeah, me. But there's like no boundaries. You can be anything. You can do anything you want, right? What's the result?
We're living it.
Chaos. People do what they do. Society becomes dysfunctional. I mean, it was shame, I think, that prevented, out of wedlock marriages and, things like that.
Right.
I mean, having children.
Right. So now if you talk about things that are really in our best interest, right? You get shamed for even not having limiting beliefs, or, it's people try to shame you into like, if you say things like that, right? Even though there's government statistics and all kinds of things, you don't have to be a religious person you can point to, right? That's what I did in my book, by the way. Whenever I had issues like that, like I talked about stuff, I went right to CDC and government websites, so no one could accuse me of being some religious zealot trying to push an agenda. Because there's a lot of data out there that suggests that certain behaviors cause certain psychological issues, right? And they do happen to line up with what we would think as Orthodox Christians are the health, because remember everything with us is a medicinal model. What's healthy and unhealthy, right? So what's a healthy lifestyle for us spiritually, mentally, physically? It's not that God's mercy and grace obviously can't cut through all of that, right? So someone's, I've known people, I'm sure you have too, there's an out of wedlock birth or something, and you see tremendous grace and love and all kinds of wonderful things come out of it because people's hearts, maybe they failed in an action, but their hearts are good, and they're still, so it's not like that type of judgmental thing where I'm going, but certainly there's reasons there have been boundaries and things in place for us. But so really Father Stephen Freeman, who I quoted, Dr. Timothy Baptistas, who I've talked about, and many, many other Orthodox teachers, writers, professors, priests who deal with this subject of shame, talk about healthy shame, acknowledging boundaries, where unhealthy shame is the absence completely. And it's almost projecting your shame externally to make it okay. That's why I don't really think all these pride marches and months for whatever topic it may be on, it's just shame out there, right? It's pride. I mean, think about it. Pride. That's the very thing we're trying to get away from, right? That hubris, right? It's more of the humility, the healthy boundaries. So, and I think that's why you see, statistically, a higher suicide rates and other things among certain groups of people. And a lot of that's always the inability to bear shame, right?
Well, I think what our society is going through now is, first of all, I don't think that shame on a theological level, shame is acceptable. I don't think shame on an outside national level would be an acceptable politically correct term. I
Right.
think it would be misunderstood. So the way we avoid shame is normalizing everything. So there are no more boundaries, right? But even if we take away those boundaries, it is, the bottom line is this country, from what I see, we do not invest in mental health. Because even if you take boundaries away, the person still has to deal with their head, their heart, and society. And if you don't give them, no matter what they are, if you don't help them with mental health and give them the strategies to cope and live productive, healthy lives, whether they participate in one parade or another, they're still human beings. They could be God-loving, God-fearing human beings that just need help. Let's face it, everybody's got something. Everybody struggles with something. But to normalize everything is the inability to acknowledge the need for mental health care. And that is the biggest disservice that you can give any human being. And that's what makes me sad.
Yeah, and if anybody's ever been through mental health struggles, whether it's yourself or one of your loved ones, trying to get care is hard. First of all, everybody's booked up. There's no, I mean, it's just hard. It's not, you're right. We're not set up. You know, you brought up something, and I have it for later on, whether we'll get into it today or next week. But I have some notes here about a sacramental versus psychologized understanding of reality and society. And we've moved away, certainly. Like I know sometimes in our country here in the United States, I know some people, watch this from other countries. We say sometimes, or we hear dialogue, we're a Christian country, and that's just not true. We've never been a Christian country. We've been a country of some Judeo-Christian values, right? But a Christian country, by definition, is a country that lives in a sacramental understanding of reality. There is no this sacred and secular. There's none of this, divide, right? So, I was looking at some notes here. It's certainly the contemporary psychotherapeutic model is very much about the individual inner chaos, right? But it's not really in a sacramental framework. So, I think that if you ever, and I've said this before, if you ever go back and read the Holy Fathers, where they essentially talk about mental disorders, they don't necessarily use the same language, but they talk about it, and it's so brilliant because it is such a complete. They didn't have the science of our day, but they certainly had a complete understanding of the full integration of body, mind, and soul, and always dealing with a person's disorders at all levels, right? And I can only imagine if the science of our day, so today that's not really. We have, I guess, I'm not an expert on this, and certainly there's people in this room that are smarter on this than I am when it comes to the medical fields. But it seems like we're almost rediscovering this connectivity of body, mind, and soul. When we go down to holistic medicine or and it's like it's rediscovering, frankly, and it's kind of catching up to what we lost. But in this sacramental framework, we have this understanding, and so all treatment is at all levels. But I think it's going to be impossible for us because even if we step it up, the care, the model itself has some flaws in it that are difficult. And it'll depend on the practitioner. So I think that it's hard, and certainly, bringing it back to what we're talking about today. Somebody's speaking loud Greek outside the room. This lack of boundaries and this perpetuation of it as a virtue is just going to cause more mental health issues.
Yeah,
that's part of the problem.
Yeah, we missed the whole mark.
What's that?
We missed the mark in this society on how to handle mental illness. I think it's more ignored than anything else, and that's sad because our jails are filled with mental illness more than helping them.
It's tragic.
Yeah. You know what the irony though is? So many people are embarrassed to go to for
Help. Yeah.
help. Well, I mean, to go see a psychologist or to go to a priest, for, confession.
Well, and I think that being individuals from a culture that the old way was, no, that's dealt with within the family. You don't let other people know your problems. You don't
No,
do
shame.
these things.
Shame. It gets back to
Yeah.
shame.
Right?
That's
It
back
goes
to
back to the
shame.
unhealthy shame.
Right.
Because it was dealt with within the family. But then you fast forward, and those same people see, as soon as they experience those
Excuse me.
services, that we are very fortunate to live in the area of the United States
Yeah.
we do,
Mhm.
because not every part of the United States has the accessibility that even we do in our location,
No.
right? But when they start experiencing these services, their hearts open up to, wow, this is really better for me. It's better for my loved one. But it's knowing where to look first.
Yeah, and it's also a lot of it's retro in the sense of how we have to deal with it. That's why I don't think it's wonderful when we can raise young people with a deeper understanding of the sacramental nature of the church and what it's all about, because it gives a basis for dealing with some of these issues in a more healthy way. But that's hard because we don't always understand it ourselves. I mean, thought about confession. A lot of people don't go to confession or think of confession in a morality model, right and wrong, as opposed to a medicinal model of being infected. So meaning like it's enough to go to confession and just say, Lord, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. Doesn't you have to go, I sinned this, I did this, because you're talking about something that deeply wrong with us at a sickness level, and confession is medicinal. Matter of fact, Father Demetrius lately, when someone was expressing anger at God, his first reaction was time for a confession, and he was doing it because he's smart priest. He knows that that's an unhealthy attitude. It's going to sink into you. So it wasn't like he didn't lecture the person on why you shouldn't or shouldn't be. It's just more of you need time for your medicine, right? And yeah, there's a lot of, I'm sure you've all heard it, the forgotten sacrament, but it's still like I think I think I'm safe to say that everybody in here has bathed recently, right? I don't smell anything to suggest otherwise, right? Bathed, right? Taking a shower or a bath, right? So, but that's what confession is. We take, but that's what confession is. Remember, John the Baptist was baptizing while people were confessing. So baptism is our initial washing away, our initial treatment of the illness of sin, and then confession is the daily showers or the repeated cleansing of that.
So you're saying he was the first multitasker?
Don't go there. Multitasking is a myth. We can only do one thing at a time, right? But no, he was the first. He was the first one to be the practitioner of what's effective and efficient, right? So,
from what you just said, Andrea, what I see, and I'm thankful for it. I think back, how many women many years ago, our grandparents, for instance, there was a miscarriage. It was never spoken about. Think about that pain. Now today, people open up when something like that happens, and thank God they do, to heal themselves. But I can't speak fast.
Well, bearing pain and shame alone is not really manageable. Maybe you can do it for a little bit, but in the end, we're communal creatures. Our whole faith is local and Eucharistic. That's why I've said many times it's from the inside out. It starts in your own heart and it's right around you. So everything gets back to this local Eucharistic model, and certainly bearing pain and shame. You got to bear it, but you bear it with people right around you that love you, and hopefully, right? Because otherwise, it's not bearable. Not over time, or it fractures you inside if you try to go it alone. But to your point, and that gets to part of, I don't want to be too all over the map here, but that gets to what I had in my notes too about how society, in particular consumer society, shapes us through shame. Or that's where I was getting at. The initial quote was, those forces sometimes cause us or lead us to construct an identity that's not really necessarily who we are. And look at fashion, for example, right? It's very easy to be shamed into you're out of style. you know, you look like garbage because you're not wearing the latest thing. You know, hey, you're wearing those shirts whose lapels are too long. You should be ashamed. Yeah. It's all to get you to buy stuff, right?
Exactly.
Think
Of
about it.
course, because it recycles anyway.
Exactly right. It's all, but at its root, it's a shaming activity, right? That's what it's designed to make you feel less. So I gotta get the wider tie because everybody else is wearing them. I look like a putz, you know. I feel bad about myself. So you're
No, I was agreeing.
okay. Just look, I didn't know if I. But yeah, so
I think shame in itself causes an embarrassment
yeah,
to people, and that's what people feel is that embarrassment, and
Right.
that's why things don't come out.
but it's designed to do that.
It's
A lot of
exactly to do
marketing is
that.
based on that.
Yes.
And so it takes a strong presence of mind and a strong constitution. Like I always told my daughter from the day she was born, I could understand. I kept telling her, she gets mad at me because she's like, Dad, you connect things that make no sense. We were watching a one of these National Geographic things, and it showed the salmon. You know, they swim upstream, and of course, you know, I get all Plato on her. Life is like a salmon swimming upstream, right? Meaning you have to go against the grain a lot because that's where the truth really lies. So I said that's what it is, right? It takes a lot of personal conviction, strengthened by the community you're part of, to stick to what's true. That's why Christ always used metaphors. Or wide is the gate that leads to destruction. With the Son of Man, will he find faith on this earth when he comes? It was always the masses are usually going the wrong direction, but we want to be part of the masses because shame dictates to us that we feel shame if we're not. So it takes a lot of. And how do we get there? Well, it's the things of the church. It's the sacramental life. It's doing the things day in and day out that strengthen us within, but it's not an individual thing. It's a communal thing, right? It's
It's interesting, Michael, when I was, there's like kind of a dual track out there in the internet of people like showing their, what I call the Facebook effect, like their perfect lives, like pictures, but at the same time, there's this sharing of like, I'm a victim, right? The problem with those is that it's the compass of shame, what you were talking about. Clothing is material shame, right? It's materialism that you're missing the mark versus a spiritual shame. So we don't have this. There's a reason for off mark spiritually that we should feel shame. But this victim culture and this notion of identity politics, this notion that you should feel no spiritual shame. But we feel a lot of shame in the material world. We all the time. We don't have the right car. We don't have living in the wrong neighborhood. Wearing the wrong tie. And we do feel like it has a visceral human, we all feel this, right? But the question is to move beyond that type of shame. And when we do something that is spiritually harmful, we should feel shame and have a certain dignity of trying to overcome that. But we've gone the opposite, where we have no moral or spiritual shame. And just because you feel it should be right. And we kind of cater into that.
Yeah, you hit on this dichotomy. I was smiling. I have to confess something. So my wife has a 2009 car, and she loves it because it still has like you can put 8 CDs in it or whatever. She still likes the CDs.
I like the key. Yeah.
But she got it banged up, and she was ill when it happened. She never dealt with it. So the car's a little dented. So we had to take her car to church the other day, and I'm like, I don't want to drive that car to church. Everybody's going to think we have no money. We're poor. Talk about shame, But here, I like what you said for a lot of reasons. But one of the things, think about the consumer society, how it links to that. I mean, because you're talking about the materialism, but it's also because in our consumer society, unlike how it's been in antiquity, God has become a consumer choice. You can believe in him or not. It used to be there was no doubt about it. Everybody most people believe that God exists, or at least believed in the spiritual part of reality. Now the question was whether you took it seriously or lived. That's a different story, but the belief was there. Now in today's world, God's a consumer choice. You can believe in God, you cannot believe in God. You don't like this, you can pick that.
It's probably even about like the passions or the seven deadly sins.
Yeah.
Right? We have a little more, a little less depending on who you read, but the notion of self-restraint versus what's the term when you eat all the time?
Gluttony.
Yeah, gluttony, right? Like we are down to a society where like, hey, if it's passion, you feel it, there's no constraints, right? And
if it feels good, do it. And then the marketing.
Yeah, it's right. So it is this notion that we just I've lost the compass of what the boundaries, as you were saying, of shame. They're the wrong field of play, if you will, right? So.
And it all ties into the identities we project or try to live. And then, people, there's some people that are extremely influential that have fractured identities and are pulling people down that road, and I think the church, I mean, obviously the church is brilliant, but sometimes I just forget or have to be reminded of how brilliant the church is. Look at right before we go to Holy Week, they give us Saint Mary of Egypt, who led a boundaryless existence of no shame. And we see that result. But yet, God called her to a different place, and she was willing to a place of complete humility to the point of walking on water, right? I mean, so it's what I'm talking about today is that's what before we go into the holiest time of year, and you can teach all kinds of things from Saint Mary of Egypt's life. So this isn't just about boundaries and shame, but what I'm saying is you can make a reasonable case that's very much because she had no boundaries. She was a sexual predator, right? Some of the times the story about her is for money. That wasn't most of the stories are no, she just did it because she could and liked it and just. But then you see, so we get this complete extreme view of what it's like to have no boundaries, no shame, to healthy shame and humility and full communion with the Lord, and the willingness to go through the refining suffering that it took to get there, which is another thing in our culture about our identities. Suffering. There's an emphasis to avoid it at all costs, right? Not to go through it, and I mean, so I think that's why I'm kind of ending the year going in this direction is about identity because it's so germane to everything we've talked about this year, and it's really important for us to really
When I
understand
tell
our
my
own.
kids, you're trying something to elevate yourself, and you don't find any discomfort in it and pain in the small pain, you're doing it wrong. I tell them. So if you're going to college and you're taking these classes and you're like, this is fantastic, or you're going to the gym and picking the lightest weights, after a year, you're not going to grow. Like I could take the basic arithmetics and say like, this is great. You got to take calculus 3 and it's hard. You got to go to the gym and feel some pain.
Yeah.
Spiritually, it's the same thing. I think like suffering and pain, I guess, are different, right? But like we call it suffering. I guess there's like avoidable, but if you want to grow spiritually, like coming to church, praying, fasting, asking for forgiveness, understand the notion of shame, and that's hard. And so, it's no different, I think, in any other aspects of our life if you want to grow. That's all.
Yeah, I think, and there's a distinction between like needless suffering versus suffering because, and I think personally, go ahead.
It's discomfort. Coming to church or fasting, your instinct is just to eat the steak dinner, right? Like you're hungry, you want to eat. And the idea of self-restraining yourself, whether you're on a diet for your physical point of view or for your spiritual aspects, are they're a parallelism, if you will. Obviously, spiritual is the focal point, but it's the same notion. Like it's hard to do, but there's a reason behind it as you go on, right? You hope that your theosis, like you're closer to God, or become closer to God because of these practices, liturgical, the Eucharist, the fasting, the prayer, and the confessions. At least that's the hope, anyways.
Yeah, and I think it's also because of we get messages that are societal messages that are the opposite.
Yes.
We're taught so what you're talking about is essentially is freedom. It's a reality, right? It's freedom gained through discipline, through boundaries, as opposed to
getting an award for doing nothing or this social, promotion, and you're not ever supposed to feel discomfort. I mean, we kind of do physically. You're in air conditioning all the time. It's raining, we stay inside. Like we don't deal with the physical torment, if you will, that we once did. But I think if you avoid any notion of spiritual suffering, you're going to not grow.
Well, it's also because, and I understand why we think this, but it's not what Christ said or did, right? We kind of all, like C.S. Lewis said, we want the God that's going to gather us together at the end of time, saying a good time was had by all, right? right.
Yeah,
that'd be cool, right? But that's not, Christ said, in this world you will have trouble.
Yeah.
His victory was a spiritual victory, and it was pointing us to a final victory, so we can, like Paul says, we can grieve with hope, not without hope when we have things. But the message he said is, I didn't get rid of the suffering. I'm there. I'm with you in it, and you're going to grow. I don't think that's the message we want today. We want the message of we want to avoid suffering. And Father George Kateri used to famously say when he was here about comfort, he used to always say, when do they tell you we're going to make him or her comfortable? That usually means death, right? So comfort is death in many respects, right? If you stay in your comfort zone, there's no growth. There's stagnation. It's a form of death, right? It's not that you have to have this bravado and, like my football coach made me think that the more pain you had, the better it was. Sometimes pain was just pain, but it's the notion of what you're talking about. And I think sometimes, I don't know, I'll throw this out and see if you guys think it. It seems that sometimes when things are just bad, we wonder, where's God, or why is this happening, or I shouldn't be suffering. And we ask ourselves the wrong questions or make the wrong statements to ourselves, because that's the reinforcing message of society and marketing or whatever. Have this stuff, do these things, have everything, no boundaries, no pain, no suffering.
Yeah, and I tell my kids, you look at the Hollywood types that have everything, and how in the end, they ricochet from one relationship to another. They're more morally deprived, they're lonely.
Look at suicides, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not the answer in the end, right? It's what you're.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with Hollywood types, but I know in my
No,
I have some. But I have some. I do have some where I'm going. So in my business, I work a lot with writers, and writing is, by and large, writing is not a lucrative field unless it's attached to certain things. So in my business, because it involves government contracts that are millions and billions of dollars, people that can write and articulate proposals get paid a lot of money. So I've encountered a lot of formal journalists, Hollywood screenwriters that come into the business because they, certain
follow the money, right?
They follow the money because most people, famous actors, famous authors, there's some and they make tons of money, but most don't. And so I've heard their stories about what Hollywood's really like. And they've told me, whenever you hear someone's sick in the hospital, it's drugs. The suicide rate is horrible. The pedophilia is horrible. It's not the world people.
Pedophilia, huh?
That's what they say. I'm not, I've just heard them talk about it, and it's very dark. And I remember, myself, because I've written and published stuff and whatever, and I can honestly say at almost 58 years old, I do it because I enjoy it. It's part of my DNA. And if it helps people, I start very locally because I really believe that everything we should do, especially in our spiritual teachings, whatever, should always be based on where you are locally. So parish-based. And if it grows organically outward, so be it, right? But I have no desire to be well known. I have no desire for fame, because that, if I did at any point, that's been dosed with reality. And you hear about these people behind their lives, and I'm sure you've known people that are very high profile people, and then you get to know their stories. And it's not what it's not what it's cracked up to be. The real, to me at least, the real beauty and joy of life is usually right around you in your anonymity, except for a few people that know you. You know them, to know and be known, and that's why I think even, and other people have written about this and articulated far better than I do. But it really is that's why you look at Christ's model. He had himself, then the 3, then the 12, right? So it's really a mistake to try to appeal to masses prematurely, right? We have to work with on our own identities first, and then right around us. And so I guess what I'm getting at overall, most models of success or most models of how to be are kind of not in keeping with the model that we have. But that's the model most of us follow, or most people follow. That makes sense? You agree with that? But I think it takes age and wisdom and experience to kind of get to that place. Some of us later than others. I listen to people now in their 30s. I'm like, you're so much smarter than I was when I was 30, or 20s even. But that's really what it gets to. It's kind of being able to know yourself honestly and know your own boundaries, so that you could live like the salmon going upstream with greater ease, right? It's hard. I don't know. I just did a podcast recently, and I hope I didn't insult anybody, but I talked about, us Greek guys. We're all conditioned for achievement and success, right? Right. That's the messages we get a lot, and sometimes it gets hard because if you don't fit that model, and I wasn't busting on Greeks, but as a whole, Greeks are a successful group of people, and
Like
they're
Jewish people,
very
right?
yeah, they're just very upwardly mobile oriented, right? And sometimes that's, I mean, it's not a bad thing necessarily, but sometimes it gets in the way of the things like we're talking about in this room in terms of our priority order. You've heard me talk in this room that it's not really an either or, it's just getting everything in order. And that's what God's justice is. It's always just God getting things back in order. And it's not, and if you don't want that order because you're doing something wrong and that order disrupts your wrongness, you're not going to like it. That's what hell is, right? So I know I'm waiting for the hate mail on that one, but it's true. So anyway, let me take a pause there. Is this all hanging together? We're kind of going all over, but the root of what I'm getting at is this whole identity thing.
Nailed it.
I nailed it. I guess we're done then. No. What do you think? I want to close on something though, and explore this a little bit. What do you think about this consumer society and the notions? What about rugged individualism? What about that message about the young people get especially?
Rugged individualism?
Yeah, this country, they say this country was founded on this ethic of manifest and
okay.
rugged individualism, right? What I'm getting at is this whole notion of individuals versus persons in community.
Well, I lost you for a second. So based on what it was founded on, but right now it's gone the opposite way in terms of image. I think people are trying to distance themselves from the ruggedness to the inclusiveness, for lack of a better
Well,
word.
yeah, but yeah, I guess that's what I really wasn't looking at it from that angle, but I think that's correct. No, I was just looking at, I have my notes here. There's some of these quotes I have about, there's always been in America, this one guy, as Father Peter, I'm quoting Father Peter Kavanaugh. He says, America has a pervading reverence for individuality and autonomy.
Well, I think of Marlboro Man, right? The cowboy,
My stepfather did that. He was a model that
No
did that.
way.
Yeah, my late
Oh, he was
stepfather.
a model.
Yeah, he was a model photographer. He did some of the Marlboro Man ads. I remember growing up with that.
Oh,
Yeah,
my God.
yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting, concept. I think it does go to our culture of the frontier.
Yeah.
And well, even coming here originally with the colonials and then going out west in the frontier and the notion, it's been misinterpreted, I think, because you go out west, but you didn't go literally as a solo, practitioner. You still had a family.
Mm-hmm.
You still developed a community. There was still a preacher of sorts. But I understand where you're coming from. But unlike other cultural manifestations of growth, I think America was kind of unique in that regard. And that's why I think we're entrenched with this notion of individuality and the notion of reading the Bible and interpreting the Bible yourself.
Yeah.
As an inspiration versus the saints like we do, or the Pope and the Catholic, like we all have our focal points. But so I see where it's coming. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's been misplaced, I think, over time.
And it's grown in a direction. It wasn't
Right.
like a lot of things. It starts off with a good thing. Yeah, one, you talk about West and frontier. One Christian sociologist, and I'm blanking on his name, and I think some Orthodox priests have written to this too, but I could be wrong. Once California and the Pacific were reached, they started looking backwards, where a lot of problems started. The beginning of some of the things we're now seeing manifest in the 2020s began when there was began with this whole notion of reaching a boundary and trying to, now that you can't push through now you're turning internal. What other boundaries can we push through?
I mean,
We reach physical boundaries.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, not to get too deep in.
No, it just was interesting thought.
Frederick Turner wrote a thesis on the closing of the frontier, and there was no social engine, social safety net, kind of notion in America. Like, hey, you just out went west, you found some plot of land, you handled it yourself, not for government. And then as time went on, you start the beginning of government subsidies for farmland or whatnot, and then of course so that's where I think it comes from. But I think it's been misplaced, like I said, like this notion of hey, you're all by yourself as one singular person in society. I don't know if that's the right way to.
Yeah, and I think some of us maybe in this room are more sensitive than others to it, because depending on what stages our kids are at, right? Mm-hmm. Although now you have grandchildren, we have children the same age, you have younger children. It seems to me, I say seems because I haven't done it exhaustive. It just seems like there's so much more focus on individual self than there's ever been. Even the selfies, like, you can make a case some of that's benign. I don't want to like vilify everything, but some of it points to something unhealthy, right? Even some of our adult contemporary friends. I mean, some of them just have fun with social media, and it's no big deal. But you got to wonder what some of them are doing. They're posting incessantly. What's going on there? What's I don't know. That's just something I think about. But I may be a little biased because my knee-jerk reaction, maybe growing up a bit like a prodigal, which is always to try to be under the radar, right? I never warmed to social media. Even doing this, I never warmed to the idea of social media, of projecting your life out there, right? And some of it's good. People stay in touch, so it's all bad. But it just, I don't know. There just seems to be such a.
But some of it is important. Like, now I'm doing consulting, right? If I don't post something on LinkedIn to remind people I'm doing something new and I'm still around, they'll forget about me.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things you have to do in business, although,
Yeah, but the social media that the kids are on,
yeah.
the children are on, really affect their self-image completely.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is just the way of marketing and advertising has just changed. So we adapt to the change, right? And there is a certain notion of
Right.
I mean, there's a difference. Like today, I did this, and I walk on water and whatever. Yeah.
I saw this comedian. He was funny. He's like, he said, think about, he goes, the people coming up are going to be terrible old people, because he said the old people today are great. They show you a picture, and it's of something they did. Like I stood next to Kennedy when he gave this speech, or this generation is going to be like, here's my breakfast 7 times. Here's me doing duck face.
Right.
It's gonna, yeah. But it's kind of true, right? It's like, yeah, and I think you're right. The identities of younger people, and it's harder for them, and it's not their fault, because they didn't make these tools. People our age gave them these tools, and now we've given them and so we can't give them these things and condemn them for using them. We got to help them, and then the first thing to do is we got to help ourselves, right? I mean,
we talk about shame, and there was that kind of family shame or group shame, but when you replace that with what's okay online and what's embarrassing there, I mean, we were talking about clothing and stuff like that, but it's replacing one with the other, and the other one's not healthy.
Yeah.
Or potentially not healthy, or maybe always.
I think they have a tremendous challenge with their identities, and I think, and that's why it's so important for the adults in their lives, the adults in their lives, to really, for us to have our act together as best we can, as sinners that fail too, but at least
And
like this.
There's a lot that don't have adults in their lives.
I know.
Too.
I know.
That's the other problem.
I know. But go ahead, Andrea.
Well, and the other thing is that you look at these middle schoolers now. So it's like the perfect storm, right? We've been in a COVID shutdown for 2.5 years. So who knows which children have been in abusive situations, that school was their sanctuary to get a meal during the day. So we've gone from this non-social, all electronic situation to now coming back into a social environment and really not have the social skills that 2.5 years later that should have been developed.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then now we're hormonal, right? In middle school. And then add on the social implications going on, with gender and all of that. And you assume that they all have that adult. Many of them don't.
Yeah.
Talk about the perfect storm for a mental health situation.
I know.
That's the problem.
Absolutely.
It's a big problem, and it's actually it's almost an overwhelming problem when you think about it.
Overwhelming.
And it's
Yeah.
not like you can put
More
the toothpaste
than
back in the tube
ever.
anytime with this kind of system.
No,
It's
we're looking at
out there.
a social, emotional, mental health cleanup just from these kids, probably for decades.
Yeah.
Forget those children that have learning disabilities and needed those extra skills and haven't had them, and you talk about working parents, and it's just, and I'm not the doom and gloom. My philosophy is, well, this is where we are, so let's figure out how to help move it forward.
Yeah. I'm not doom and gloom either. I mean, that's I mean, that's not even, that's when you fall into despair, right? That assumes we see everything that's going to happen. Quote my favorite book, Lord of the Rings, even the wise cannot see all ends, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, too bad John's not here again. I wish I could work and talking. But to your point, yeah, it looks bad and things are very sadly overwhelming. But in the end, thank God God's God, because he's not bound. Talk about boundaries. He's the only one who's not bound by anything.
Right.
Right? And we never know, we never know how things are going to turn out, but we just know what we have to do. I guess we can close on this, being faithful, right? And faithful isn't just cognitive assent to what's true, it's living it. Faithfulness is by what we do. I was talking to someone actually the other day, talk about identify, and this is going to sound a little harsh, but I needed to make a point to this person. They said, well, I'm a Christian, and they're lamenting about society. I said, time out. Are you? When's the last time you went to church? Do you do anything that Christianity tells you to do while you're talking about what the rest of the people out there aren't doing? You talk about, the country's moving away from God and the church. And I was like, well, when's the last time you went? I wasn't trying to be harsh, but trying to point out we have to do these things, right?
You talk the talk.
Yep, we have to do it. It's more, the sheep was the one who walked the walk without even thinking about it. They just lived it. So that's why I think, when I get overwhelmed, I just remind myself, okay, what I can do is be faithful, and then be around other people that are faithful and let it ripple out like the pebble in the calm lake, and then do the best we can with where we're at. I think the problem I have sometimes with overwhelming is it leads me to inaction. I can't feed the world, but I can give you something to drink, right? And that kind of mentality. So and I think you said it. You're not you're laying out the problem clearly, but not without hope, right?
I don't have doom and gloom, but I definitely have gloom.
Yeah.
I think Andrea hit it on the point. I think there is a huge issue, and but what I don't remember a kid I didn't know who wasn't. We lived in a very Catholic neighborhood when I grew up, but now I don't even think there's a narrative of God, right? It's completely absent in some. At least my kids aren't overly religious. Teddy maybe, but they've heard the other narrative, if you will, and through it all. And so even Elizabeth, she's in 9th grade. The teacher will always make comments about. She's like, "Oh, I need to Friday off to go to church," and like, "Oh, you're fantasy in the sky," or I don't know how he's.
Yeah, Ellen told me that. Yeah.
Wow.
Pejorative, but the point is, like, to your point though, everything you just said, I agree with you. There's working parents or single parents, but there is no conversation or very little conversation about the notion of God and redemption and everything we just talked about of shame and spiritual discipline, the Eucharist and community. I think a lot of kids are adrift, and everywhere you just said, but also just spiritually.
Well, that's what I meant about, Christian country. I was actually in the hospital the other day, and the guy with the collar walked in, priest, obviously, and then he started talking about the 7 sacraments. I'm like, oh, Catholic priest. And he was talking to the receptionist, and she said, I'm a Christian. I don't know, because he was there to anoint, and she didn't understand any of that.
Oh, wow.
And so I went up and had a conversation with him, and he's like, "Oh, you guys have 7 sacraments too." I was like, "Well, we think of a little different, But it was even
Nick was mentioning the thing about going to Egypt and they didn't know the Trinity. I heard 9 out of 10 don't know it either here in America.
Yeah.
But anyway, so okay.
Yeah. So, but the encouraging news is, I think we've been a little spoiled because we've been fortunate in this country. Up until now, there's been a lot of freedom, that's not the norm. The faithful, it's always been a remnant. It's always been a small group that remained faithful. I mean, thank God we have the monasteries. They do their thing to sustain the world in prayer. And we shouldn't, as much as, I'm preaching to myself here, as much as the numbers seem overwhelming against what's right, it's as long as somebody's remaining faithful, that's been the model, right? Israel was, all the 70 nations went to hell in a handbasket, and God said, I'll form my own, right? It's always been a remnant. So anyway, we're right at time. So we're going to honor our pledge to be done at 12:30. So God bless everybody. I hope for those of you that listen to this out there, this was edifying, listening to this conversation in this room. We're going to do this again next week. And then the second week of May, we won't have class. Mother's Day, I'm out of town. And then I think we're going to conclude when our Sunday school year concludes in the May 21st or whatever it is. So God bless everyone. Have a wonderful week, and we will be back next week.